The CCCR, or Centre for Creative and Cultural Research, investigates the ancient, innovative relationship between social culture and creative production. Based in the Faculty of Arts and Design at the University of Canberra, we generate scholarship and artwork in a wide array of humanities, social science, applied and creative disciplines. You are listening to a fresh presentation from the CCCR's Culture and Creativity Seminar Series. The presentation was delivered with slides. To view those slides, or to learn more about the Centre's work, please follow the links in the program notes. This podcast was recorded on the unceded lands of the Ngunnawal and Ngambri peoples.
Yuma, hi everyone. Good to see you. Dawaranuna, Dawaranunawal. We're on Ngunnawal country here, of course, and I'd like to greet the elders and storytellers and thank them for preserving culture and country in this place. I'm Owen Bullock. My pleasure to welcome you to the seminar series for the Centre for Creative and Cultural Research. Professor Paul McGee has programmed the series for the rest of the semester, but he's now on leave. So I'm filling in and introducing people, but he's here today, which is nice. So my pleasure to introduce our speaker, Jane Messer. Jane's a visiting fellow here at the Research Centre. She's a former associate professor and director of creative writing at Macquarie University. Her book, Raven Mother, War, Family and Inheritance, a Memoir, is her first full-length work of non-fiction, following three very successful novels, Hopscotch, Provenance, and Night by Night, and academic research on mother and work.
My book, Raven Mother, is three things. It's family history, it's memoir, and it's a partial history of the British Mandate of Palestine, the Holocaust, and the Nakba. I spent many years researching and writing the book, as you can imagine, years during which I had my doubts that an Australian publisher would want to publish such a marginal text. So it was quite, I was sort of writing against a grain of imagined success, so to speak. But then after October 2023, Raven Mother suddenly became timely. That's what people would say. It's so timely, Jane. I'll go, yeah, it is. And maybe even politically urgent. And it did find a publisher in NewSouth Publishing, for which I'm really grateful. They've been excellent to work with. Originally, I began the book for personal reasons. I was a writer, always wanting to write. We were always looking for what we want to write about. But I also wanted to excavate the history of my grandmother, a woman whom I knew little about, whom I'd never met, but had grown up hearing about. This somewhat personal quest evolved into biography, into social history, then memoir, and then political history. So I began the project not really knowing what I would do. I thought maybe it was an essay. It became much more than that. The research took me to Melbourne, to Berlin, where I lived twice, which was where my father was born, and to Israel. Where I went three times to do research. It's been a huge undertaking. Just a little bit of background to the book and that personal reason for writing, I guess. So I was lucky. I grew up with both my parents. We would sit at the table. My parents would talk to each other and to us, have conversations. And as a child, my dad would tell us stories. I'm the eldest of three, about his life growing up in Berlin as a German Jewish child, and then being forced to leave when he was 8 years old, being taken by his mother, Bella, my grandmother, to England with his older sister. His sister was quite a bit older than him, which meant that he was a little bit more alone, I guess. And they were taken for their own safety out of Nazi Germany to a school called New Hurlingen School, which had clandestinely fled Germany in 1933. And he arrived in 1935 at the school. It was still quite small. It had been sponsored by the British Quakers, but the teachers at that point were all German Jews who had been teaching at the German school and had left. What happened then was that world events just kept rolling on, and his parents returned to Berlin, but then were able to immigrate to Palestine in 1937. My grandmother realized that war was imminent and various mistakes and administrative errors took place in Australia. So what happened was that my grandfather and my aunt arrived in Australia just before the outbreak of war. My grandmother was in Palestine, British Mandate, and my father was a child in England. And so that situation continued for many years, and he didn't see his mother for another 12 years. He didn't, and he made it to Australia eventually in 1947. So that was quite a traumatic experience for him. And that was the story, that was underpinned the stories that I was told as a child, and which sort of sank into me and, clearly wouldn't let me go. So I'll just read you a couple of pages from the opening of the book, and that will give you a kind of flavor of, because I am in this talk talking about literature, and so literature is not a newspaper article or whatever. So maybe you'll go, yes, Jane Messer's book is definitely literature. The book is called Raven Mother. A raven, in the German word is Raben. So Raven Mother is Rabenmutter. So my mother was die Rabenmutter, a raven mother, my father said, using the old German expression for a mother who is harsh and abandons her children, an expression that I had discovered, in fact, and he'd then grasped hold of. She'd left him twice, in 1935 and in 1949. She never loved me, he said. Bella never once said the words, I love you. Never is such a strong word. Was it true? I hadn't seen my father with my grandmother, that was certain. She died long before I was born. I was a witness to nothing between them. So began the search for the answer to the absence of loving words, which might have been flaws in his recollection, he simply didn't remember them, or flaws in her. Perhaps she hadn't said them. In place of recollection, I've spent years researching her by talking with him, finding her letters, travelling to sites, archives, speaking to people, reading histories, and much more. I've gone back in time to where she began in Berlin, to the last years of Jewish Berlin, through to the mid-20th century and its eventful years to our here and now. The result is this book that's portmanteau, memoir, social history, biography, the story of three people, me, my father, Michael, and his mother, Bella, and of four countries, Germany, Palestine, Israel, and Australia. In an afterlife, if Bella and I were to pass each other on the street, she'd walk on by without knowing me in any way. And for most of my life, it would have been the same for me. I wouldn't have recognised her. The work of this book has changed that. I'm bringing us together here in these pages. I'm looking her in the face, checking her pockets, looking under her skirts, reading her letters, searching out her confidences, honouring the welfare work she did with children who suffered in World War I, with the poor of post-war Berlin, with the child refugees who fled to Palestine, and recognising that she brought her own children to safety out of Nazi Germany. Bella's life came to span 2 world wars, the collapse of Germany and the annihilation of herself as a German. As millions of others did, she lost colleagues, friends and family during World War II and the Holocaust. After fleeing Germany in 1937, she lived for 10 years in what was then the nascent polyglot city of Tel Aviv, amid a scattering of old Palestinian villages, among dispute and collaboration amid new and old friends, without her husband or children. As a corporal in the Palestinian Auxiliary Territorial Service, the ATS, stationed in Egypt during the war, she worked to protect Palestine. In her few remaining letters that we have, she writes about the present and the future, matters to do with her life in Palestine and later Melbourne. Her 2 children grew up without her. In many ways, they stopped caring about her over the many years they lived apart from her. She had a long affair with a man who was also married, but that relationship ended in grief and bitterness, and my grandfather never forgave her for it. She left Palestine for Australia in 1947, arriving a few months before the nation-state of Israel was declared. There seems to be a pattern to her of making a life that is full and rich despite everything, year upon year, until Melbourne. She'd survived the war and the Holocaust, but she didn't survive the surviving. So she left. So my father felt that she'd left him in 1935 at the school and then again in 1949 because she took her own life 2 years after arriving in Melbourne. There was nothing for her to do. She was, by this stage, in her mid-50s. There was no work. She had no friends. Her children had grown up without her, as I said. So that's the family story, as it were, very, very compressed. But what I focus on today is the more political history of the book, and which comes later, which infuses it, but where I really deep dive into it, and I think part 4. So during the 3rd research trip I made to Israel in 2019, when I'd been writing the book for some years by this stage, I placed myself in Jaffa, which is still home to many Palestinian Israelis. Some of them are indigenous to Jaffa. Their families always lived there, and others were displaced there from other parts of Palestine and Israel that they'd been living in before 1948. I was there to meet with Palestinians and peace activists and academics and to listen and learn. I visited demolished Palestinian villages, visited Hebron in the West Bank. I toured the Gaza border areas. I accompanied Israeli volunteers working with Palestinians. I knew about the Nakba dating back to 1948, and during that trip, my aim was to learn more. But my awareness, as it did across the world, escalated in October 2023 during the week which began with the Hamas terror attack, and then in the weeks and months and in fact years that have followed with Israel's response, horrific response and war on Gaza. I had a final draft of Raven Mother during these months in 2023. I'd been ready to find a publisher, but I put that on pause and I returned to do more reading and more research. I realized that I had to really, really understand what was going on, the history, the politics, with a lot more depth. These terrible events had made me even more determined to use my literary and research skills to write a text that might inform Australian readers of the intertwined histories of Palestine and Israel, of Palestinians and Israeli Jews. And I did, I guess, want to be persuasive without didacticism, without recourse to intentionally partial truths, without recourse to slogans, satire, invective, or false histories. The polarisation of narratives in the news and social media was extreme. It was verbally violent at times, and that sort of verbal violence was becoming normalised. I read posts that said, all the Jews in Israel should leave. I thought, all right, yeah, where would they go? Like, what do we do with the millions of people who are displaced everywhere here in the world? How can we displace more? It seemed that people were yelling things that fundamentally couldn't be enacted. I read posts describing Palestinians as monsters. I read that all Palestinians are born hating Jews. It's even upsetting to even say these things aloud again. I read that a Jewish writer I knew was a Nazi. I accompanied my father to a Holocaust survivors memorial luncheon, and we suffered in silence as the journalist Shari Markson from Sky News claimed that the famine in Gaza was fake. I mean, she literally said that, the fake famine. I'm sure everyone here can recall how polarised and often misinformed much of the discourse was from every vantage point. I was discovering during this time that if I were to write honestly about my family history, that there'd be political consequences, and that writing honestly about family history or a family history such as mine should have political consequences. Raven Mother is a memoir and biography, but there's a great deal of social and political research underpinning it, and it's the only way to understand the family story, my family story. But what did I want to persuade readers of, apart from, factual correctness to my claims, my well-researched claims? Like, what was the underlying urge that I now had? And it took a while to work out. To have compassion for two terrible histories and the people who suffered and suffer still. To listen through reading and hearing people and then translating that into words. To believe in dialogue rather than war. Might sound like a bunch of truisms, but sometimes truisms there is some truth to them. But these things that I wanted to do, that is what literature can do. By literature, I mean writing that's imaginative, that's artistic, whether it be fiction or non-fiction, such as prose or play or poetry. It's this kind of literature that I'm talking about that can be inexhaustibly inventive in its subject matter or form, that can imagine, ingest, and represent every kind of experience and knowledge. Literature can offer us the imagined life, and it can give us the stories that recover the real. Literature invites the reader to reflect on their own moral compass. It engages us in empathic relationships with those that are like us or unlike us. The British writer Andrew O'Hagan describes literature as an immersive social lens. There's so many things we can say about it, of course. In the act of private reading, we can encounter each other and others far from us through, to quote James Wood, another Brit, proximity, fellow feeling, compassion, and communion. Literature is value-laden and challenges us to test and review our own values. By reading and listening, we activate our creativity, our powers of analysis and critical thinking. We can exercise our memories, mobilize our real and imagined ears and eyes. The best literature rescues, to quote James Wood again, the texture of life from death and historical oblivion. Literature can, and I believe should, confront misinformation and ignorance, preserve and challenge cultural histories. Salman Rushdie, the great survivor, has said that good writing assumes a frontierless nation. Writers who serve frontiers have become border guards. Such was my intention with Raven Mother, to believe in the possibility of a frontierless nation. And as I warned, I was probably going to forget to do my slides, which is what I did do, which I did forget to do. So I'm just going to move forward. That's more or less where we're up to. Sorry about that, guys. So the act of writing and publishing Raven Mother became a collision between my personal testimony and public discourse, or some public discourse. The book entered a mess of polarised debates. And I don't mean that in a disparaging way. I understandably, every argument that has been put has been put forward with great validity and earnestness. People have been here in Australia have been deeply traumatized by what is happening in Gaza. So please don't think that I'm in any way thinking less of that because of the polarization of debate. At the book's launch in April this year, my heart was pounding with anxiety that someone would yell at me or arrive with a placard. I mean, a Jewish person. No one did. In fact, it stepped quietly into a tangled, fractious argument here in Australia about racism, historical injustice, rising anti-Semitism, rising Islamophobia, doxing, trolling, uncertain definitions of cultural safety and free speech, worsening acts of anti-Semitism, including the massacre of 15 Jewish people at Bondi Beach, and state governments' attempts to limit the freedom to protest and limit the freedom to speak. We saw that with two premiers, I think, speaking up against Randa Abdel Fattah. The visual arts and literary communities have been the most vicious towards their own here, I would say. Is there another industry or field which can match the arts for the number of public and covert cancellations of writers, artists, of boycotts of individuals, events and institutions, the rescinding of arts grants and arts board mass and partial resignations, the cancellation of Australia's oldest major literary festival, the International Adelaide Writers' Festival, seemed at last to knock some sense into the arts community. At a public level, these conflicts are quieter now. The false choices we have been given, I felt, through this polarised discourse was to be either Holocaust-centric or Nakba-centric. But these two histories are irrevocably and gravely intertwined. As Edward Said wrote, Palestinians are the victims of the victims. The Holocaust and the Nakba are intertwined but fundamentally different. Both the Holocaust and the Nakba should remind us to know our own and others' histories better and to struggle always against racism. Both show us that racisms have their own individual histories. Anti-Semitism is perhaps the oldest racism in the Christian world and most virulently experienced by Ashkenazi communities in Spain and Portugal and amongst Germanic and Russian peoples. But this long history, which I cannot possibly undervalue the strength and the terror of it over centuries, doesn't cancel out the other racisms that we see around us. It doesn't take, I believe, precedence over, for instance, the fact that First Nation people here have the highest rate of deaths in custody than ever before. The experience, for instance, of Sephardic and Mizrahi Jews of the Middle East and North Africa is also different. So basically, I think we need to attend to racism's individual histories and to not collapse them into each other and make them compete with each other. In their remarkable book, The Holocaust and the Nakba, A New Grammar of Trauma and History, Bashir Bahir and Amos Goldberg write that the Holocaust as a major episode in human history highlights the ever-present possibility of sliding into racism. It ought to be a continuous reminder for the whole of the human race of the importance of standing vigil against the insidious encroachment of racism and of refuting its very assumptions. The Nakba, on the other hand, is the embodiment of the same colonial expansionist reality that gave birth to the apartheid regime in South Africa, causing people everywhere to unite in struggle against the shameful regime, culminating in its eradication. While the Holocaust might seem long ago to some here, it's 70 years or so ago now. It still profoundly shapes much Jewish experience and sense of self today. The worsening anti-Semitism in Australia terrifies many, and for good reason. My father's Jewish aged care home has police present now at all times, though my dad said with a shrug, "Who'd want to kill a bunch of old Jews?" "Well, actually, Dad," I said, "some would." Australian Palestinians, though, they have lost families, many friends. They are people who well before the war in Gaza knew they could never return and are daily aware that the state of Israel aims to eradicate them, eradicate the culture and histories of place, along with even doctors, journalists, lawyers, aid workers, those essential workers. It's part of their community. In an extraordinary novel title, because I thought, God, I should quote from some beautiful literature in my talk. So I thought, what book do I want to bring out? It's a beautiful book called The Book of Disappearance by a Palestinian American writer and journalist, Ibitsam Azem. Two young men are friends, set in Israel. One is a liberal Jewish type, the other Palestinian, mourning the loss of his grandmother, who tell him about her memories of pre-Nakba Jaffa. The novel takes place, it becomes a sort of speculative fiction work at a certain point. The novel takes place in the 48 hours following the total disappearance of all Palestinian Arabs within Israel. The reason for the disappearance is never learned, but the unexplained absence causes increasing paranoia amongst Israelis. The novel takes you deeply into the consciousness and experiences of both men, of Ariel and Allah, using the speculative twist of the complete disappearance to ask or to say, is this what you want? Will you be comfortable living like this from now on? It is indeed a grim irony that the starved and traumatized Jewish survivors of concentration camps and labor camps arriving in Palestine took the homes, villages, and tools of Palestinians, just as non-Jewish Europeans had taken their emptied homes, their businesses, drunk from their teacups after their flight, after they were deported. And all of this didn't take place because of some natural long-standing enmity between Jews and Arabs in Palestine. That's for sure. These are people who'd lived in more or less peace. I don't want to over-exaggerate that because humans are always fighting for many, many centuries. The Nakba and current war arose, however, from the confluence of political events orchestrated by governments and industrialists. Just aware of time, so I'll keep moving. The grimmest irony of all is that Israel then aggressively inherited the expansionism that had been practiced before its formation by colonial powers, and it has now become the colonial occupier. To which I will add, when I say Israel, I really aren't talking also about every individual who lives there, because when I have been there, I have met many peace activists, people who fled pogroms and racism themselves, people who work as volunteers, people working in universities, doing incredibly good work. But there are many, the whole education system in Israel is such that it educates Israelis to believe that Palestinian deaths in the past and now are unfortunate, but an unavoidable consequence of a just war to protect their homeland. So it is deeply inscribed in education practices. So it makes it all the more remarkable, I guess, when Israelis stand up against what's happening. And And it's also very hard to speak out in Israel today against the Gaza war. You can get arrested, you can lose your job. So they're very brave people when they do that. So after October 2023, I'm just a writer, right? I'm previously a fiction writer. And now I'm writing this text, which has just entered this intense, vortex of dispute and real events. I was repeatedly asking myself about the responsibility of writers and of me as a writer when individual family history is so entangled with public history, which is still unfolding. I'd engaged, because I was trying to finish the book, a well-known and highly esteemed literary editor for a structural edit. And they recommended that I remove the political history that I had included, not talk about the history of Palestine and Israel. They recommended that instead I write more about my teenage years, which I really wasn't interested in, and make the memoir more personal, that this was a more commercial proposition. Their reasoning was, you do want to get it published, don't you, Jane? And it's very hard to get memoirs published. But I thought to myself, are you saying that because of the commercial content or because of what I was writing? Because this editor was Jewish. Anyway, I didn't follow their recommendation. But I was very troubled because I was already upsetting a lot of people that I knew. And so I went to the Ethics Centre in Sydney, which I would highly recommend. You can book a 1-hour phone call to discuss an ethical dilemma, such as I'm having an affair and I don't know whether to tell my husband or something like that, I suppose. I don't know what people ring up with. The counsellor, Kay, who was excellent, she began, as she always they do, what was my dilemma. It took some time for us to work through because it wasn't straightforward. Eventually, I realised that my dilemma was I was afraid of how much I'd be hurting people I knew with my book. I don't mean my father. He had been reading drafts and our political views are very well aligned, but others. And talking to Kay, I recalled that through my 30 years of being a university lecturer, I'd always held the view that the university should be a site for critical and creative thinking, for experiencing ideas that are challenging and even discomforting. In my teaching, I had always articulated that when it came up to my students. I hoped that I had always emboldened them to ask questions and consider new ideas. Don't be safe. I'd say this is the one place in society where you're going to be encouraged to explore and challenge yourself. Unless you work in the arts, of course, where you'll be perpetually challenged. Ask yourself, what is risky thinking and writing to you? Search that out. And I was always glad to articulate that when I was a university lecturer. I was proud of that, proud of what our institutions should still stand for. In talking to Kay, I realised that I needed to give those same words back to myself, to my writing self. I knew what I believed as an educator. The same was true or needed to be true for me in my work as a public writer. And yet it was, in fact, a choice that I had already made, to write into the fray, not to skirt it, to write what I knew would alienate me from many Jewish readers and communities here. And that has come true. I have lost some Jewish friends who've angrily told me that I'm not Jewish enough, that I don't understand racism, that I associate myself with fringe ideas and fanatics. I took out media and publishing insurance in case a hate speech or anti-Semitism case was vexatiously brought against me. Meanwhile, as in my work as a writing mentor, thank goodness I continue to work with First Nation, Jewish and Palestinian writers. I've been cancelled by Jewish Writers Festival. And yet at the Canberra Writers Festival in October, I'll be speaking with an Australian Palestinian writer, Majida Adaway. who I personally know as well. Maybe we're the first such pairing since 2023 at a festival. I've discussed whether genocide is a word I should have used in the book with one of Australia's most eminent philosophers. Is the Holocaust the essential measure of genocide or not? Is it a denial of the Holocaust's wrongs to describe Israel's actions in Gaza and the West Bank as genocidal? I do use the word genocide in Raven Mother fairly early on page 28. Some readers will put the book down at that point. But literature can speak truth to power, right? That is what it's meant to do. Confront authority, demand morality, accept risk. That is a Baynard Rustin quote, by the way, from his 1942 pamphlet, Speak Truth to Power, A Quaker Search for an Alternative to Violence. And I just thought, because I'd been thinking about that quote, and I was thinking, was that Foucault? And then I looked it up and I'm like, oh, Rustin, how interesting that he's a Quaker and that the school that my father was taken to safety to was also sponsored by the Quakers. So there's something there in the Quakers. I think we should follow through with them a bit more. Long before the war in Gaza, I had become alert to the erasure of, as I've said before, I want to go back to that idea of literature of presence and absence. Why were there no mainstream history? So I'm going back, doing more reading, more research. Why was there an absence of mainstream histories of all the peoples who lived for hundreds and indeed a couple of thousand years in Palestine, the Jews, the Arabs, the Christians, the Bedouin? Why did I have to go so far back before World War I to kind of discover this pluralistic literature? So I did all that and realised in a way that literature had been the original site of my first encounter with extreme polarisation. Because what I was doing in my reading was discovering how you can write entire histories, but really, and I should know this as an Australian, right, erase so much. So I guess that's, what I'm doing here with Raven Mother, joining others and trying to write back into that erasure of the Nakba and of a history of pluralism, of people living peacefully together. So we need literature that does that. And that's what literature can do in these times of polarisation. This is a time when we need the power of good writing and literature to embrace all of the living and all of our dead, to hold the contradictory and difficult together in two hands, palms open. Thank you.
Thank you, Jane. We've time for a few questions.
So thank you very much. It was a really great talk and interesting. But I'm interested in the questions of what history is and what truth is, and whether history is in fact a question of fiction and you being a non-fiction writer and a fiction writer at the same time. But then it all comes back to the individual. And I'm really interested in your story when you talk about this Raven Mother and how the story of your Raven Mother, or the Raven Mother, whether she's originally a fiction and then she changes to a different fiction, and where you personally came to in terms of your journey with that question.
Right. I mean, I do think things really do happen, and we can very much work hard in our research if we weren't there ourselves to find something that approximates the truth. I wasn't sure how relative you believe truth is, but yeah, I mean, look, with regard to my grandmother, as I said, I never met her, and I think a long impulse came out of the fact that I was the child. For a long time, I believed I was the child of an unwanted child. So to be, the child of somebody who wasn't loved, in your writing, sometimes you hit a really uncomfortable place. And I think for me, it was discovering that I had a lot of shame around that, as anyone would. And then I really wanted to prove to my dad, prove is just a crazy word, but that's kind of what I wanted to do, that I wanted to show him that she'd saved him, that he'd felt he'd been abandoned, and he did feel abandoned, he did feel unloved, but I think she definitely loved him, and everything that I have found, the traces of her that I found, showed that to me. But yeah, I never met her. I can only imagine her, and I don't think there's much point to doing that beyond my personal family experience. If I didn't make the book far more than that, what do we learn from this? We learn that, one of the impulses that I guess in a more theoretical level, apart from the personal, was that I did a lot of research in mothers and mothering practices, and I became really interested in, the stories, very absent stories of mothering in the stolen generations, of the stories of mothers of migrant women. The Tampa affair, I was really activated by that, by just thinking, these are mothers and fathers saving their children, and yet the propaganda is that they threw them into the sea. So then I started to see her as part of this long history of mothers during war and mothers during famine and mothers as refugees, and that mothers and fathers and carers sometimes separate themselves from their child, and they do it, millions are doing it right now, so that their child will have safety and will have a future. There's, I used to teach Nam Lee's short story. It's like a long short story called The Boat. He's a Vietnamese Australian writer. And in this beautiful story, he writes about a mother in Cambodia putting her only child on a very unsafe vessel, but to stay will be much, much more dangerous. And I would use that story in my teaching, creative writing, because it's a beautifully written story and you can teach a lot of craft and technique. But the great thing was too that I got some really important history about Australia's history of migration and the experience of boat people into that teaching. Yes. Oh, sorry, that gentleman, and then the gentleman in the behind.
Thank you, Jane.
Thank you.
I bring greetings from Kavita Nandan to you because she's teacher at Macquarie University with you. Fiction and reality, the world as it is today, this distinction that we as writers often make, is it valid anymore? Whether you take Australia, I don't want to mention any name, but you know what's happening here today, or the Middle East, or India, or Europe, or America. Now, we are so concerned with our own lives. We think that's the reality. But fiction, and I'm very happy that you invoke the name of Salman Rushdie. I think he's the greatest writer of the second half of 20th century in English. There's no doubt in my mind. And there's no greater book than the Satanic Verses. In fact, I used to teach that here for my master's class. And the response was quite overwhelming. But we have become afraid. The writers are fearful now. You go to a writer's festival, they talk about their writing, about what they're doing, and that's very moving. Your memoir or anybody else's can be extremely moving. But they don't have the courage that Salman Rushdie, in his latest book, I have read Knife, and before that, the book of essays called Languages of Truth, in which he says things that I don't find anybody in Australia mentioning even or taking up the issues that he does or he did in Satanic Verses. We still live in the myth of the Middle East, whether they're Jewish, Hindu, or Muslim or Christians. Last night I began reading the Mahabharata. When I see the world today, as you know, it's the longest poem in literature. And it was written 3,000 years ago, but what it says is so powerful that the world today is what it is already envisaged there. And only Salman Rushdie has taken the issue with the myths by which we live. So what is the role of the writer or literature in getting rid of this and being truth to life, not just truth to literature, but truth to what our life has been over centuries. Would you like to make any comment on that? It's a small question.
For that question, I'm sorry. Look, I do think, I mean, you know, everybody has their observation. I think, I do think a lot of us, I mean, we live in a very multicultural society, and Australia's quite unique. But do we do that society as well as we possibly could? No, not yet. Are writers afraid? I think definitely at the moment, because it can be pretty vicious. So I think the current polarized situation and the cancellations are not encouraging people to be braver, or might encourage some. I think that's problematic. It's difficult if you compare, you know, Salman Rushdie's, he's a product of such a particular kind of set of circumstances, plus his own natural brilliance. How can we have another Salman Rushdie? I would actually say, I do think we do have a writer equal to him. And I think you find that in Alexis Wright. I think her work is remarkable in all the ways that his is. She's got that level of genius. She's got that level of like technical brilliance. She's got the humanity and the heart. So, okay. So we've got an Australian Salman Rushdie. That's Jane West's vote. Alexis Wright.
Hi, well, thank you very much for your talk. My name's Rick. I have a million questions for you. However, first I wanted to congratulate you on your courage to walk into that shitstorm knowingly. I think that's, you know, that takes, it doesn't matter that you're afraid. The fact that you still did it, I think is really,
and I'm not a brave person.
So I think that's really important.
Thank you.
But in terms of getting history, particularly from family, and this is something I'm looking at the moment, I've got also an interesting family, is you're getting history from family, but they will have their own bias. They will, you know, make up things. How do you reconcile, you know, their versions of things? I mean, you can do your research, kind of try see. But yeah, how do you try to get to the truth? And what do you do when you realize maybe their perception or their telling is not actually the truth?
So, yeah, that's a good question. Because it's one that when you're writing about family history and talking to people in your family, they will definitely potentially have very different views, and it can be quite distressing to them or to you. My approach was to write into that and not avoid it, to write about the differences that we had, my father and I, to respect his experience, to expose my own. At one point I talk about how I managed to forget something that I should never have forgotten, something I read in a letter, to be honest about what I was wanting to find. I wanted to find my grandmother to be this wonderful person. Perhaps she wasn't, you know, so I kind of lent into it gently rather than away from it. I did show the manuscript to my father twice. He was getting very old. He's 99. So he did read it. At one point he got quite angry. He said, "You haven't made Bella bad enough." And I said, "Well, that's because I don't think she's as bad as you say. But look, I've said, you know, I've done it here, here, and here." So we found a place of accord and mutual respect. But I'm lucky, you know, like I'm just lucky. He was a very reasonable person. And there are sometimes when people are writing that it could cause a breakdown in their family and they would lose relationships with people. I can tolerate losing relationship with friends, as upsetting as it is to have lost Jewish friends. That I can live with, but I wouldn't, I wouldn't recommend people break relationships with family without a lot of thinking about it. Is the writing important enough, or is their relationship more important? But I think that's so individual and takes a lot of deep thought.
Great, thank you. We can carry on discussing things over drinks. Please join us next door for a coffee. But let's thank Jane first. Thank you.
Thank you. Thanks very much.